The title of tonight's presentation is Nature and the City and Nature, and I think work is a very nice jumping off point for us to talk about how we, as humans, occupy the earth and how we bring nature into our built environment. Nature, it's a semantic question, really. Are we part of it, or are we living in opposition to it? How do we balance that? What is the relationship to the city? And nature has so many expressions. Is it wilderness, or is it actually a managed agrarian landscape? Is it composed or formalized gardens, recreational or commemorative places, places dedicated to human interaction, or that favorite strange 20th century concept we like to use, open space? So the history of the urban treatment of nature in the city has also evolved over many centuries, from the preciousness of a luxury of having a walled garden in a very dense pre-industrial city, to a formalized landscape where rigid geometries demonstrated an imposition on the landscape of man onto nature, both in planning and literally in the plant materials, cones of trees, to other ideas, naturalized romantic conception of the landscape with connections to moral improvement. In the 20th century, we've seen new models emerging in which systems of nature are addressed and attempted to be incorporated. But there was also a huge trend, not all, both good and bad, of suburbanization, essentially extending a low-density urban environment into the surrounding land, often radically altering the natural systems in that process. And lately, we've seen the aestheticization of working landscapes, and I'm talking about farms, rivers and waterfronts, brownfields, rail lines. These have actually turned into drivers of placemaking, community building, and economic regeneration. Another huge trend that everybody who touches this work is inescapable is that we are really in a profound revolutionary period in our consciousness about environmental impact of humans and industrial society. These issues can include, forgive me for being obvious, sustainability and energy consumption, climate change and carbon emissions, natural disasters and sea level rises, which have brought questions of resilience of the very resilience of the cities that we live in to the fore. There's a great effort in trying to understand better the systems, these larger systems, interconnected systems of nature, whether they are weather patterns, the effects of air and water pollution, the migration of animals and birds. Much of this effort has actually been made possible by technological revolution in the collection and processing of data, collection we could never have done just a few decades ago. So I'm going to start with a couple of very lofty questions and we'll move on. With these great questions available, this information available, these questions emerge. What does it mean to our original topic of balancing or designing the relationship of nature in the urban realm? Are we creating an entirely new paradigm with the technical and the new sensibilities that we have and the technical power that we have? Is this new, or is just another trend? Are we moving just to the next phase? In more concrete terms, how can urban design respond to nature, particularly in the shape and sensibility of those spaces? How can communities reinforce and bring nature back into its form? These are all very big questions. We're going to get a little bit more focused here. We have two distinguished guests who we hope will help explore them. Both are involved in large-scale projects in large cities, particularly our examples will be in New Orleans and Chicago, and they're working with these concepts of natural systems to inform the human experience of nature in their communities. I'd like to welcome Douglas Meffert and Beth White, who will present their work. I'm going to introduce you a little bit of biographical information on you when you come up. So we'll do it that way. I'm going to start with Doug. Doug Meffert is a vice president of the National Audubon Society and the executive director of Audubon, Louisiana. He leads Audubon, Louisiana's programming, which includes large-scale coastal restoration, state coastal master plan implementation, climate change adaptation, bottomland hardwood conservation in central and northern Louisiana, urban bird-friendly community programming, and chapter engagement. In addition, he heads the management of the Paul J. Rainey Sanctuary, Audubon's oldest and largest sanctuary, which is 26,000 acres, established in 1924. He also stewards the protection of Louisiana's 23 important bird areas. Prior to his role at Audubon, Doug was program director at Tulane's Payson Center for International Development, deputy director at the Tulane Xavier Center for Bioenvironmental Research, and he served as New Orleans representative on the United Nations Scientific and Cultural Organization Urban Biosphere Reserve Program. It's a mouthful. He has a we can say it was UNESCO. He has a Bachelor of Science in Engineering and a Master in Business Administration from Tulane University, and he earned a doctorate in Environmental Science and Engineering from the University of California, Los Angeles. As mentioned, he was a Loeb Fellow at Harvard's University Graduate School of Design, and also had a fellowship from the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. So, Doug, please come on.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Tom. I want to thank NCPC for convening this event in honor of Christine, and of course the Mayor's Institute on City Design, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Loeb Fellowship, which is always and always will be near and dear to my heart. As Sally mentioned, I had the lucky pleasure of being in the same Loeb Fellowship year as Christine, and in fact we were roommates in the Doble House, which is the main frat sorority house there, and that living experience was also known as the reality show of the Doble House that particular year. But I got to know Christine really well over those times, and Bob, I was really struck by your comments at the beginning, because I remember when Christine arrived and drinking glasses of wine, and we would be talking about our future and what we call the Doble curve of what is our next best thing, what is our legacy in life, and she was balancing this. She was like, well, I'm really interested in city design and urban planning, but I really want to get pastoral. I want to get out back into agriculture, and I want to get into the country. And Christine had that way of just sort of getting it in terms of blending these different sorts of ecotypes or habitat types and land uses into something cohesive, and that's what she ended up being known for in her legacy. And with that, she had this unique ability of being that person in the room with her, as it's been said, her quiet but firm way of expressing things, getting people together in different disciplines to think around something common and larger than themselves. And so I'm honored to be here, and I'm honored to be here to think about Christine in this particular topic. The city and nature, and examining nature in urban design, as Tom indicated, I am a scientist by training, and so when I think, and especially with my role at Audubon right now, I tend to reverse that. I tend to think of urban design and nature as part of a larger context, and that's part of what I'm going to be talking about here. I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction of Audubon and how we think about birds, not only in themselves, but as a focal point for large-scale hemispheric conservation and restoration. And then I'm going to talk about two different case studies. One, City Park in New Orleans, bringing ecology into the park and what it means for birds, wildlife, and the people that interact. And then I'm going to tell a story about a bird that needs these particular habitats. I'm Audubon, I'll get fired if I give a presentation and don't talk about a bird at some point. See bird already, so that's a condor. So with Audubon, this is a whole slew of white pelicans which migrate up and down the Mississippi Flyway. And that's how we work at Audubon. We by looking at birds as a focal point, as it says here, 10 billion birds use flyways. We have 4 major flyways in North America: Pacific, Central, Mississippi, and Atlantic. And these birds need these flyways to basically, it'll be in the next slide, but to cross all through the hemisphere, to cross from Canada down to Patagonia. And where we are in Louisiana, which is in the middle of all those squiggles there, an amazing 40% of the migratory birds spend part of their life in coastal Louisiana. Our wetlands in coastal Louisiana, they're the last stopping point that birds, when they're migrating down from our winter to go to their summer in South America, where the last place they can feed and forage and rest and really fuel up before they cross the entire Gulf of Mexico, 500 miles. So it's like loading up your gas tank in a car to make that long journey. And it's the southern part that they need to rest up and fuel. It's the northern parts that they often need to breed. So all these areas are critical in their own way in terms of sustaining birds and other wildlife. And I wanted to mention the bottom right thing here, because when we talk about humans, what we do at Audubon, we see that birds are integral to our human existence, and humans are integral to birds' existence. We're both top of the food chain, and basically, if your bird populations are healthy, and if your human populations are healthy, then chances are everything beneath is pretty healthy too. So they're a wonderful entry point into large-scale conservation. And so, Tom, when you were giving your introduction, I was thinking, well, I'm glad I have this slide, because this is how we work in terms of conservation. Because if you think about it, where are birds not on the planet? I mean, they're almost everywhere on the planet. They're on our farms and our ranches. They're on our coastlines, very critical areas for nesting. The important bird areas he mentioned, these are more natural habitats. Climate change is affecting birds. We may be talking about that and threatening a number of birds in the future. But also they're in our backyards and they're in our parks. And so what we call bird-friendly communities, this is the aspect that urban environments play, not just for bird watching, but for bird survivability. These are very important ecosystems for birds. So I'm going to start with my first case study, which is City Park in New Orleans. Beautiful live oak trees, if you've ever been to New Orleans, with Spanish moss hanging there. City Park is a 1,300-acre park in New Orleans. That's about 50% bigger than Central Park, to put that in context, 150 years old. A beautiful park that has emerged over time. And I'm about to go into a little bit of a Katrina story. It was frankly underutilized and undermanaged, and in many ways inaccessible. Not many paths for bikes or walking or birding. Most of the places you would go, you would be paying money to do. There were too many golf courses that were underutilized, in my personal opinion. And other aspects. So it was a beautiful park, but you couldn't really access most of it. And where it is located, I wonder if this thing points at all, but it's basically, I'll talk louder, but it's in this third rectangle there in the middle. That's City Park in a historical map from the 1880s showing New Orleans as it was developed as the Crescent City, building on the natural levee of the Mississippi River. And all that area with the dipples there was cypress tupelo swamp. That's where we were founded here. And of course we drained the city, we built it out. And when Hurricane Katrina came, you see that dark blob in the middle of the north there, that's City Park. It completely flooded with brackish water, killed a lot of the water oaks, magnolias for sure, and actually created an avenue for a lot of fast-growing invasive species like Chinese tallow to come in. And so it was pretty much a wreck after Hurricane Katrina, but if you can turn a crisis into an opportunity, as we often try to do, it created sort of a re-examination of the city park and what it could be actually for the community, what it could do actually in terms of providing flooding protection as a reservoir, but access for people and access for wildlife. And so with Beth here, I want to give kudos to Trust for Public Land, rethinking a former golf course in the area adjacent to the New Orleans Museum of Art, if you've been there. This was sort of a wasteland after Hurricane Katrina, but TPL came in and said, well, let's make this something different because no one's playing golf here and it's a mess. So they went in, they raised the money, and they created these wonderful trails that are beyond the trees that you see there, these walking paths along water in what's called Big Lake here at City Park, stocked with fish. There's swans, gondolas that actually connect to the bayous in the sculptural garden at New Orleans. So it's mixing the art and the environment, removing the invasive species and planting native species on the trails, plant species for birds and other wildlife. So they were the first success story, and So what was a wasteland now probably gets more visitors between that and the sculpture garden than anywhere else in the city. I mean, both residents of the city as well as those who come to the city. Beautiful, beautiful area. So a couple years later, and Sally Young and I have talked about this project a lot, but I came back to New Orleans after my Loeb Fellowship, which was after Hurricane Katrina, and this is the period where just urban gardening was sweeping the nation as a phenomenon. That was just not for New Orleans, but in New Orleans, because in City Park and in other areas, we had this reexamination of, well, can urban gardening work for a community in this area? And so what happened was a nonprofit was formed called GrowDat to work with at-risk youth, K through 12, in terms of field trips, but also interns more in high school, for training on urban gardening. And I'll just have to make an aside on GrowDat, because maybe half the people here don't know why. If you live in New Orleans, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But anyone heard of the New Orleans Saints football team? Maybe not this year. We're kind of terrible. But especially last weekend, that was hard to watch. But so when we're doing well, what we like to say is, who dat say they're going to beat them Saints? Who dat? Who dat? So who dat is a very common expression in New Orleans, and so the youth farm there is growing dat, and that's exactly what they're doing. This is a group of the students from last year's internship, but hundreds of students are coming in field trips, and with GrowDat, by growing food, we're growing leaders. You know, it's not just teaching, bringing in students and learning about agriculture. They're learning about healthy eating. They're learning about exercise. They're learning about how to market their produce and sell it to local restaurants. So they're learning how to run a business. And so it's been wildly successful and growing in the past couple years, just north of where Big Lake is in City Park. And this is just a rendering. In the bottom left, you see the structural facility for the base and then agricultural lands surrounding it. The building itself, this is not a rendering, this is actually a photograph. Tulane School of Architecture in the city center there worked with GrowDat to build their core offices and where students can come in from training. The hazard yellow boxes you see, they repurpose containerized cargo to develop the offices there. So it's an entry point into the gardens. And so, you know, like I said, the youth come in both in terms of field trips, and it's integrated into New Orleans curriculum right now, how agriculture works with the environment in this urban environment. And what was happening about 2 years ago, I was noticing that, and I'm friends with the chair of the board of directors there, and he was just talking about the growth of the the growth of the farm, and that as students were there, they're adjacent to this more natural habitat in City Park, and they would be wandering around these trails and saying, well, what's down that trail? And what's that bird? What's that butterfly? What's that plant? What am I seeing here? And so we put our heads together, and I was thinking, and oh, by the way, these are the same trails that ecotourism tourists as well as our local birders would be doing birders. So we're having birders bumping into gardeners in this beautiful urban landscape. And so we formed a coalition, Audubon, Louisiana, with City Park and the GrowDat Youth Farm and the Orleans local chapter, as well as Collectivo, which was our design firm, to develop what's now called the City Park Birding Corridor. We've been building it over the past 2 years. Our official grand opening, although it's open right now, is in mid-November, November 14th. If you're down, come on by. But you can see here, I don't know what y'all are seeing in the back. I know you see a screen, but basically it does connect GrowDat on the bottom to these birding corridors in what's called Couturier Forest, which is actually the highest landmass in New Orleans. So you get to see all these different ecotypes in a very short area. That's about a 5-mile birding trail. And so the GrowDat students, we've now integrated natural systems into their gardening systems in terms of education, so that they learn that birds like us, we're all part of a food chain and we're all part of the same ecosystem, and we can coexist and coexist to benefit each other in these areas. And so I'm thrilled that that this project has taken off. And so, when you go through a park like City Park, and when you start educating, especially youth, on different sorts of birds, this is a brown pelican. If you lived in Louisiana, you would see a lot of these. So they start with species that they know. Okay, I know that brown pelican. But we also have started a program working with their students on understanding how birds build nests, understanding how to identify nests in trees and then know which birds are there. And in fact, as this picture shows, it's a little dark up there, you see a ladder, but building nest boxes. How do you build nest boxes in these areas to provide additional habitat for migratory birds when they come in this urban environment? So this is an area not only for these students, but it's open day to day for the general public as well. And so in a similar urban park, this one's in Baton Rouge, it's called Bluebonnet Swamp. We work with volunteers in these swamps, catching birds, identifying them. And what's happening here is the gentleman, Eric Johnson, there on the right there, he's our director of bird conservation. He's a great PhD ornithologist, and he's teaching these young people how to, what's called banding birds. You put a band on their feet when you catch them, and so as they travel around the world or the nation, and if someone finds them and identifies it, you know where they're going, because it's still surprising to me how little we know about the life cycle of birds and where they go and the types of land uses that they use as they live their lives over time. And so at City Park and Bluebonnet Park, you can't see the rest of the body, but again, we start with birds that we know well, like a blue jay. That's what this one is. And then, I get excited as much as the students who see them for the first time, but of course, beautiful exotic species that call Louisiana, many parts of this country, home different times of year. Anyone know what this bird is?
Scarlet tanager.
Oh, right. I need door prizes. And a beautiful bird like this?
Indigo bunting.
All right. 2 for 2. 3 for 3. Want to guess?
Owl.
It's a barn owl. So, and this is at City Park too, and what you actually see there, so this is a mother owl with her young, and it was actually, this picture was taken as we were doing a banding session at City Park, and what I love about this picture is what the little critter is eating there, the front baby, he's eating a crawfish that was pulled by the mother from the adjacent bayou, or what do you call it here, crayfish, crawdads, mudbugs? Crawfish? I'm sticking with crawfish, but no, so the students are looking at this and they're saying, I eat crawfish, and the birds are eating crawfish. This is part of the food chain. This is part of how we interact. And so they're seeing all this now, and it's just creating this great synergy between learning and about how birds are a part of our environment and we're a part of their environment, and we need to work together on that. So my next case study is on this incredibly beautiful tiny little species called the prothonotary warbler. And the word prothonotary warbler, and it's appropriate that the Pope was here this morning, but prothonotaries are the clergy from the Roman Catholic Church. And the prothonotary warbler is named as such because these prothonotaries would have these glorious, bright yellow robes. And as you can see, this is quite a glorious little bird itself. It's on the endangered species list, and this is a bird that travels thousands of miles, tens of thousands of miles each year just to exist, to nest in certain areas in South America during our winter, during their summer, and up to Canada in our summer. So you see them here in the DC area as well when they're coming back up for our summer. So, but the problem with them is they've declined in population by 40% in the past 40 years, and we don't know why. We're starting to learn, and that's what I'm about to get at, but we know the nesting sites are somewhat intact up in the north, but what's happening south? What's happening in Louisiana? What's happening in South America? How do we piece this together to save this bird? Because if you lose that node in this mosaic of land uses, then that species is going to crash, and all sorts of other species are going to crash too. It's a tiny little critter. It's about 12 to 14 grams. And so this is not the kind of thing like a pelican where you can put a GPS unit on it and let it go its way, because it's going to sink right into the Gulf of Mexico and not really go very far at all. But on technology, what's really great about technology in this particular case is that there are these very tiny geolocators that weigh less than half of a gram that you can now put on these small birds. And that's showing there on this particular prothonotary warbler. Those fingers are not mine. Mine are a little cleaner, but that's our director of bird conservation. In any event, last fall we just want to know where these birds are going, and where are they coming back here on their migration back up north again. And so we put 77 geolocators, most of them in Louisiana, and actually at urban parks in Louisiana, one at the Bluebonnet Park in Baton Rouge. And you have to catch them, you put the geolocator on and you let them go. With things like this, they're so small, it's not like they connect to satellites, so you can't track them real time where they're going. But if they come back and you catch one with a geolocator, you can take it off, put it in, and actually see where that bird has been traveling over time. And so 3 of the birds, we did recapture about 15 of the 77 so far. The others are out there somewhere, having a good time, I hope. And what we found was really amazing here. This particular guy we named Geodad, by the way. And Geodad is the yellow line on this particular slide. Geodad started in Baton Rouge at an urban park, took a left turn to basically Texas, flew about 600 miles over the Gulf of Mexico, landed in Central America, crossed over to Cuba, and then went down to Colombia ultimately. Phenomenal 3.5-month journey. The red bird, which I think is interesting, started in Baton Rouge and just went straight for it, crossed the Gulf of Mexico, landed there in the Yucatan Peninsula, went to Central America, stopped in Panama City for a while, and then ended up in Colombia. But all these birds, the reason we know they went there is because they came back exactly from where we released them. So these 3 journeys all start and ended at an urban park in Baton Rouge. And this was actually just released about 3 weeks ago in the Journal of Ornithology. So this is the first time ever we've actually known where these birds are going. And so we hope to continue this research and figure out where they're going north. Where are they going north in the prairies and farms? Where are they going north up to Canada? And so that's our next step. But thinking down to the south, this is a shot of Panama City, sort of the eastern expansion of Panama City, which is experiencing rapid growth and even more rapid growth with the widening of the Panama Canal in recent years. And it is an urban ecological crisis right now. We're working with Audubon Panama right now because the mangrove forests, which are also critical habitat for prothonotary warblers, are dramatically being reduced. There are very little environmental protection measures, or they might exist for a year and then go away for 5 years. And that brown blob that you actually see at the bottom, that's material that's been excavated from the Panama Canal. All that massive material is basically going to, or the most of it, is going in to fill in, this low-lying mangrove marsh for suburban expansion in Panama. So you're directly disturbing habitat. You're creating basically a landscape that is not even remotely like what that landscape was. This is material from the Panama Canal that's just been placed on mangrove areas. And so what's happening is you're not only destroying habitat, what would be normally a mountainous habitat that goes into this sort of flatter habitat, you're creating this very waffly landscape. And so you have older subdivisions that would have historically not flooded, and then you're building a higher area above it from this fill, building a new neighborhood. And so areas that didn't flood, or maybe would have a 1 in a 100-year flood, are now flooding every 10 years or in a big storm. And with channelization of the canals, the natural canals there, again, directly destroying mangrove habitat, they're becoming highly contaminated. And, the water really doesn't have a place to go to diffuse into these natural systems. And so we're working with Audubon Panama and the municipality and the local agencies there, as you were saying, Tom, to protect the areas in the ex-urban areas, the habitats there, but to reintroduce where we can natural systems for flood protection, but also for protection of birds and wildlife, and for recreational use, and for local fishing. So winding up, I'm heading back to New Orleans now, just a little bit. This is an old lithograph from about 1885 of New Orleans, the city as it really did live with nature. You know, the city hugged, as a strategic port city, hugged the natural levee of the Mississippi River, but all those areas to the right, which included City Park, as I mentioned before, were habitats like this, you know, gorgeous cypress tupelo swamp. And so what we're doing to recreate in City Park are habitats like this, as well as forested areas for our recreation and for birds and wildlife. And also in urban settings, just my final 2 slides entail here, art is such a powerful way, just like ecology, to communicate how the environment is in our cities and outside our cities, and it's really a part of us. It's a part of our daily lives. This particular picture, this painting actually, is from a well-known street artist in Italy, Hitness, who had an inspiration about 6 months ago. He read about the journeys of John James Audubon, who traveled from Pennsylvania down around here in Maryland, and then went down to the South, you know, famed for the many pictures that he painted over time. And so what Hitness is doing right now, he's on basically the last month of his journey. He's doing the same journey that John James Audubon did, going to all the different places and staying there and painting the birds that he sees in those areas. And so I just took this photo last Friday, actually. This work is still in progress. I'm proud to say that's a blue heron, by the way. He did take some liberties with Audubon's poses, and he's not killing the birds before he's painting them, which Audubon did do. But this is on a building of a Loeb fellow, Neil Morris. This is on Neil Morris's building, and Hitness is staying in his back room right now, apparently still. So I think this is a great project, and there's going to be a documentary on this that'll be released in 2017 of his journey and the paintings that he did. So in ending, you know, I don't think I could say it better than Thomas Lovejoy, that if you take care of birds, you'll take care of most of the big problems in the world, because if you take care of birds, you're taking care of ecosystems in your cities, and you're taking care of yourself. Thank you very much.
Well, it's a pretty interesting setup in terms of the role of the local park and its interconnection to a much larger system that extends literally tens of thousands of miles. Our next presentation will be by Beth White, who she is, in her day job, is the Chicago Region Director of the Trust for Public Land, where she leads conservation and park creation efforts throughout the Midwest. The signature project, which I think she's going to tell us about today, is the regional office's the 606, which is a 2.7-mile multi-use recreational trail and park system along an elevated unused rail line, turning the physical barrier of old railroad embankments into an urban oasis and a unifying park for numerous neighborhoods. Her office has coordinated a variety of public and private partnerships, including land acquisition, community outreach, and fundraising, as well as managing the project for planning, design, and construction phases on behalf of the Chicago Park District. With the first phase completed this past June, the 606 builds on Chicago's ongoing legacy of creating a network of great urban parks. Prior to joining the Trust for Public Land in 2006, Beth served as Managing Director for Communications, Policy, Resource Development, and Intergovernmental Relations for the Chicago Housing Authority's $1.5 billion plan for transformation. She also has served as Chief of Staff to the Chicago Transit Authority Board, directed the City of Chicago's $100 million Empowerment Zone program, supervised the City Space program, and was the founding executive director of the Friends of the Chicago River. She holds a bachelor's degree in communications from Northwestern University and a master's degree in urban studies from Loyola University. And she was appointed by President Obama to serve here in Washington on this commission here, the National Capital Planning Commission. So, Beth.
Well, good evening, everyone. It is such an honor to be here with Christine's family. When I came to the commission and was a little overwhelmed at the complexity of Washington, D.C., Christine was one of those lovely people who was so patient in explaining how things worked. So I really appreciated Lucy's remarks about her ability to teach and answer questions, even if they weren't particularly astute questions, in a very kind way. And we had lots of wonderful conversations about cities and nature, and so it's a double privilege to be here tonight to talk about that. And as Christine had us do, she really made us think. And I've talked about the 606 project many times, as you can imagine, over the last 9.5 years. But thinking about it in terms of this question of nature in the city, city and nature, and what is it? Where is it in cities? How do you recognize it? How do you restore it? How do you celebrate it? How do you connect with it? And one of the things I typically do is go to the dictionary. So I was a little perplexed that every definition I found did not have people in it. In fact, it was as opposed to humans. So Merriam and Webster, the physical world and everything in it, such as plants, animals, mountains, oceans, stars, etc. Don't you love definitions that have etc. in them? But that is not made by people. And others said the same thing as opposed to humans or natural forces that control what happens in the world. So I was really puzzled by that because I think all of our work is about recognizing that people are part of nature. And anyway, I just thought that was really a curious thing. And our driver on this project is about that connection. And a lot has been written about the importance of humans' need to connect with the environment. And E.O. Wilson's biophilia hypothesis that states that human beings have an innate need to connect with the natural world. Many of the studies of my own organization, the Trust for Public Land, shows the value of parks and those connections. But today I want to tell you a little bit about the need to connect and how do you regard nature and how do you embrace it in a very specific project, the 606, in a very specific city with a fascinating history of manipulating nature on a regular basis in very dramatic ways in Chicago, and share the driving urban design aesthetic behind the 606 with you, and that is urban ruin, reclaimed by nature with the assistance of a design team. So I want to first highlight a video that is the day of the opening of the 606, 50,000 people strong, and I think it's just a joyful way and also a very nice way to show you the scale and scope of this nearly 3-mile long project. I mean, it really takes so many people to put together a project like this. We had a brilliant design team, we had wonderful builders, landscapers, community leaders. Everyone came together to really create an amazing project. It's an alternative transportation corridor, a park, and a living work of art. That's a pretty tall order, but I think we pulled it off.
People in the city of Chicago, we are opening up the public spaces ready to the public. Yeah. One shot, that's 2, 3.
And that's what this is all about. It's not just good exercise, and it is, and it's not just improving the appearance, but it's binding together communities, building a city block by block, community by community.
And this is great because it connects all of us with one nice path of Park District land that connects us all, and we can walk along it, be peaceful with each other, and enjoy our differences and our sameness. And that sameness, that's the best part, at the same time. Walking with your families, doing family things, and that's A1 at my point.
This is amazing what they did to this place. You know, that's just such a great idea. It used to be like a train track.
Clearly, it's a success. So
Yeah, definitely. And it brings a lot of cultures together.
So part of why I like to show that, again, is the scale and just the sheer joy of opening this on June 6th, which also happens to be National Trails Day. And it is the 606, so that was clever too. But I really want to share these urban design elements that really embrace nature and led to some unexpected delights and collaborations for programming that also embraces nature. And I'll have you set that up. So I talked a little bit about Chicago and our history of manipulating nature in very bold ways, from draining the swamps, from the fact that they were still too muddy, so we lifted the entire city. So we had the first comprehensive sewer system in the country, lifted literally buildings with people in them, 4 to 14 feet up. We reversed the flow of the Chicago River. We created a railroad system and a mechanized way of slaughtering animals that changed the landscape for thousands of miles around the city of Chicago. And part of that heritage, that railroad heritage, is why we have this opportunity today to actually reclaim it and think about the next 100 years. So Tom mentioned our role at the Trust for Public Land as the project manager. We work around the country. We've been around 42 years. We conserve land for people. Our goal is to get people outside, connect with nature. We work from the mountaintop to Main Street. And our goal is to have a park or an open space within a 10-minute walk of everyone in America. Right now we have about 10 million people living within a 10-minute walk of a TPL project. So we're doing pretty well, but we have a little ways to go. Some facts and figures about the 606. This, again, is a community connector. Logan Square, Humboldt Park, Bucktown, and Wicker Park are the 4 communities. The heart of the 606 is the Bloomingdale Trail, named for the old rail line. There are 80,000 neighbors along this 10-minute walk of the trail, and 20,000 of them are children, 21 schools. The embankment structure itself sits right in the right-of-way. It's about 18 feet tall, 30 feet wide, does widen out at certain points. The 4 neighborhoods were very park-needy neighborhoods, particularly Logan Square. And this shows you where it connects in the city and our eventual goal to get it to the river. Currently, it's about half a mile from there. But its early history as a rail line is one of a typical Chicago history story. The railroads, this particular line went in the 1870s. This was at a time of enormous and rapid growth for the city of Chicago, one of the fastest growing or the fastest growing city in the world. But these conflicts, they were killing so many people, an average of 1 per day, that the community along these lines, and you see these children, people living right next to these railroads, really organized and protested, and it took years, but the city council finally relented and raised the tracks. And I want to go back to this story that was in the paper. They passed a resolution to hire 3 experts at first to study the problem, but they did eventually get to it. Now, this was one of the last lines to be elevated. They decided that if they had to do it, they would be the biggest, the best. They would keep the trains running. They came up with a brand new way to pour concrete. You see this mechanism here that allowed them to do it faster and just create amazing mass. These are giant concrete bathtubs, essentially, connected by 38 bridges. That pretty much describes the structure. Here's one of the largest expanses over the street at Humboldt, and this was just before we started construction. But what happened in the 1990s is the rail service really dried up on this line, except for the last few blocks, and the community began to rediscover it. They put art along the viaducts. The nature took its course, took over this green ribbon, and you saw these almost prairie-like settings up top. You see this beautiful desire line. People were scrambling up there on a structure that was designed to keep people off. But the railroad would come in a couple times a year and clear it all out. Beautiful prairie plants gone, but people still kept going up there, running. They were trespassing, but the railroad has one guy for every 500 miles of track, so they don't exactly police it. So we saw what happened in the 90s with transportation planners looking at this to see if the Chicago Transit Authority could use it for the Circle Line or other transit projects, and it was ruled out. But the bicycle planners were looking at it. And then along comes a comprehensive open space plan for the city of Chicago. And since this is the National Capital Planning Commission, I feel like I need to give a shout out for planning. And really what galvanized the support was from the city space plan that recognized our glorious lakefront, 26 miles of forever open, free, and clear lakefront. But when you move away from the lakefront, those neighborhoods turn to gray. And City Space noted that Logan Square, one of the 4 neighborhoods, second neediest in the city, would have needed 99 more acres just to come up to the minimum standard. So these boys playing in Logan Square in the shadow of the Bloomingdale line, you know, folks finding a way to play volleyball over their back fence, led to a very specific plan just for Logan Square. And you'll see some of the blue, big blue stem thriving before the railroads came in and cleared them out again. And then one of the things that Tom asked us to think about is how is this paradigm changing, and are they, you know, who's leading this? And I can tell you in this instance, it was those residents. During those public meetings, the Friends of the Bloomingdale Trail came together, formed an organization, had visioning workshops, had children's coloring contest, anything they could do to make the implausible seem inevitable. Humboldt Park and Logan Square had new communities plans sponsored by MacArthur Foundation and LISC, and each of them embraced the Bloomingdale line. So in 2003, 2004, and 2005, you had city official plans. So in 2006, we were asked by the Friends of the Bloomingdale Trail to buy this piece of land that you see here being celebrated and really start the conversion. So we did. We did things like parking day. This is a park eventually behind us. But anything we could do to keep that momentum going. So moving forward with the transportation planners, one of the ideas of having it an alternative transportation corridor allowed us to apply for a $50 million federal transportation grant. So that really got things going. So in phase 1 for preliminary design and engineering, we felt very strongly that there needed to be architects, landscape architects, and artists on the team. I mean, this was an engineering assignment. This was go in and see if the structure can support a trail, do an assessment of these 38 bridges. And the city, to their credit, did that, made it a requirement of the RFP. So in this preliminary planning, they took a look at these structures, and this gives you an idea of the mass, 9 feet thick at the bottom, tapering up with earth and ballast and stone as the filler. Giant French drains, essentially. Very straight walls because they always drain. So we went through lots of public meetings, lots of ideas, design charrettes, 40-foot long aerial photos with people having conversations back and forth, more partners than I could name. So we get through the phase 1, led by engineers and an architect, with the landscape architect and artist in sort of secondary roles. In phase 2, it really shifted. And we still had the bridge engineers, but the landscape architect became the principal designer as well as the artist. And this was Michael von Valkenburg and Francis Whitehead. So their urban design focus was really taking a look at what they called the lifted landscape, this notion of this continuous corridor of green, and how do you address it? And also in Chicago, everything is flat, if you know Chicago, so how do you give it some topography and interest, and also create ways that you can bring the ramps down closer to scale so that the Americans with Disability Act requirements could not only be met, but exceeded? How do you provide seasonal interest? And birds were a very critical piece of that, and how do you create an environment where birds can thrive and eventually look like this one day, which we always love to see these renderings with the fully mature trees. And then our artist really shifted everybody's way to think about this project. And these are the couple of ideas that I want to really bring out in terms of nature impacting urban design and having a fresh way to approach it. So Frances is a trained sculptor, but she works at a landscape scale. And so she created this diagram and had us pull ourselves back and take a look at this corridor and in its relationship to the river and to Lake Michigan, which is one of the largest bodies of fresh water in the world. And in Chicago, we're pretty obsessed with the lake effect on our climate. We think about it all the time. We talk about it in the winter, in the spring, in the summer, the fall. And her thought about this and working with climate scientists is that the landscape needed to reflect that impact. So you can imagine Michael von Valkenburg in phase 1 had a really good idea of how they wanted to address it. So in phase 2, here comes Frances, insisting that they have a flowering species the length of the trail so that you could demonstrate the lake effect. And the hypothesis is from west to east, there'll be a 5 to 10 day difference in the bloom period because of the microclimates along this 3-mile stretch and the east-west axis. So her art piece, her embedded art piece is called Environmental Sentinel. It's a blooming spectacle. The 3 indicator species are Amelanchier, Weeping Forsythia, and Chinese lilac. And her inspiration came from the Japanese Cherry Blossom Festival, which you know well here in DC. And her inspiration was this data set that has been collected over 700 plus years that has the most information about climate, but driven by culture and beauty, which is something that, you know, Christine was so sensitive to and understanding of. And so I wanted to share this example because the power of that thought has now driven these amazing partnerships that we have with educational institutions like the U.S. Phenological Society, which I didn't even know existed. Phenology is the study of natural systems. Chicago Wilderness and the Peggy Notebart Nature Museum and Chicago Academy of Sciences. So we're going to set up this citizen scientist monitoring program with the students in those 21 schools, and there are about 10,000 of them, who will be recording this starting in the spring of next year and seeing if this hypothesis plays out. It's a really powerful way to engage kids in urban environments, much like Doug talked about, and in looking at their environment in a fresh and different way. You saw the observatory in the video. That was another sort of intervention and thinking from Frances. At the western end of the trail, the embankment came down closer to grade, and there was an idea to build it up from the fill that we were carving out of the walls for the ramps. And there's wonderful train traffic. If you love trains, you can stand there and watch big freight trains go by. And so she was inspired by an ancient solar observatory in Peru, and with a little adjustment from the Adler Planetarium, we now have a functioning solar observatory, and tonight they're observing the solstice as part of Chicago Hinge. I would not be responsible if I didn't tell you how much something like this cost. It's a $95 million project. The funding is coming again from the federal government, U.S. Department of Transportation, for the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Program. So it's designed to get people out of their cars and onto bikes or walking as an alternative to transportation. That's why we call this an alternative transportation corridor. We're championing the private fundraising campaign. We're at 23 million. We have 17 to go. And then the city, the park district, and the county also chipped in. So we broke ground in August of 2013, and the minute those tracks went up, you could see what this could be like with a trail. Many of the trees along the way had to go, unfortunately, and the response from the community was pretty immediate. But we took out 300 trees that were at the end of their life, but replaced them with 1,400. And these very clever bridge engineers, including this big one behind the billboard, I had to share my favorite news story from Curb Chicago because they kept looking at these renderings. Fancy arches coming soon. So the interplay with the bridge engineers who lifted this up to improve the traffic at street level, put the weight over top. The artist and the landscape architect's like, give me some verticality, so let's make an icon along the way. So it's a safer environment for the cyclist and pedestrians, and also a new icon in Chicago. And it really is the power of that sort of left brain, right brain thinking. And Blair Kamen, our Pulitzer Prize-winning architecture critic at the Tribune, paid us a very high compliment that our team that we put together had this great balance of left brain, right brain thinking, this combination of creativity and rigor that you don't often find. But the 38 bridges, this was the only one that had to come down, came down by brute force, by something that looks like a giant praying mantis. And this is the Chicago, let's just move it around. We moved this 100-year-old bridge, repurposing it to another spot on a self-propelled modular transport system that moves things like the space shuttle and cathedrals and the fellow in red with a little joystick. And it's now in place. And again, removing center piers, making traffic move much more smoothly. And this was shortly after opening, not just on opening day have we seen the crowds really flock to this wonderful park. And here are our beautiful renderings of what it's going to look like. And I just want to share really quickly, I know I've gone a little over time, some of these partnerships that I mentioned. I talked about the Peggy Notebart Nature Museum, but the Lincoln Park Zoo and their Urban Wildlife Institute just installed critter cams 2 weeks ago. So they study the interaction between the urban environment and natural ecosystems to develop standards for minimizing conflict between animals and humans. And they're looking to see what's coming back. And bats, raccoons, they did see a few rats. But we do expect, as the rest of the landscaping goes in, we'll see a more diversity in the animals coming back. And then the Morton Arboretum, which is a wonderful institution in Chicago, is working with us to do Arbor Day classes, and they believe that when it's fully planted out, it will be the status of an arboretum. And we're going to Audubon next for some birding programs. But I want to stop there because I know there's a lot of questions to get to, but thank you very much for listening about this project that I care so deeply about.
Well, I think the idea was that we would come forward, and we don't have a lot of time, but we'll have a few questions to start out, and maybe then we'll move on and take some questions from the audience. Since we're talking about, you mentioned the critter cams, I think that's a kind of interesting lead into the, I think what we're seeing a lot is a question of what's the impact of technology at all these different levels. I mean, how does it mediate the experience of nature to the people that come to these places, whether it's data collection, social media, critter cams. I mean, there's all sorts of things. What do you think how do you think this is changing or revolutionizing?
Well, I think it's a mixed bag in many ways. The critter cams are really interesting, and they're so popular. And if you ever see any of the footage of a little raccoon coming up and looking in the camera, and the scent bags that they hang by them to attract the animals, those things, I think, expose people to nature in a very different way. Some of the technology that's overwhelming to people, or they don't have a good entry point, I think is a challenge, at least in our work, particularly on the civic engagement side, and trying to get people to understand how things work. And what we found throughout the design process, the simple tools were the best. And we had maquettes of the big bathtubs, and people had trees and birds, and they made them with paper and glue and got to put them together. And they gravitated toward those things. It was really fascinating. And then we taped up the viaduct, and they would put ideas in there, and really shied away from some of the more technical aspects. So from a public perspective, I think it's a mixed bag.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I'm obviously pointed out one technology like the small geolocators and things like that. It's
it's
just
a
giving
game
us
changer.
new information that we never would have been able to gather otherwise. And so that's been a very big positive. On the critter cams, we have a couple examples. We have our Osprey cam at Hog Island, Maine, and we have our Puffin cam in upwards in Maine. So I think those end up being really powerful ways to get the natural environment to population centers. And so I think that's useful too. And another pragmatic one that was useful to us, small anecdote, is we have a lot of green herons at our sanctuary. How cool is it that you get to manage a 26,000 acre sanctuary, by the way? I love that. But in any event, some of the green herons are successful in others, and we don't know why the ones that aren't successful. So just simple camera technology, we were able to see predation from coyotes coming in there and bobcats. So, it provides that sort of useful information. But I do agree with you on the mixed bag in that there's nothing like, and I was struck when you were talking about working with youth in particular, and we find that the best way to educate, I showed the children building a nest, but we have other examples. This is low tech, but where when you're actually protecting nesting birds in migratory season, we put up what's called symbolic fencing, which is just a rope with these stakes, and our Department of Wildlife and Fisheries has these very ominous signs: stay off, get out, bird nest, no trespassing. And people usually just take a shotgun to that. But if you have school kids painting in their own classes and learning about birds and saying, don't be a nerd, save the bird, and the cute
That's
picture of a
great.
bird, and you put that sign up, people watch it. And the adults respond better to that too, and the kids are learning. So.
Right.
And then those are the
Okay.
messages in social media. That's a big boon. That's a big help, actually, in conversations. But
So it sounds like the social purpose or the social engagement is really underlying everything that you're both touching. How do you enhance the relationship that people have with the natural condition? And I guess there's, traditionally there's lots of ways of doing it. It might be gardening, like Christine was an avid gardener. There might be recreation in parks, even our own streetscapes or farmers markets, or maybe even the most denatured is what's the view from your car window as you're going down the parkway. So what are the opportunities here to actually improve that relationship? Do you want to talk a little bit about in what you're doing?
sure, I was just thinking about some examples. I think for us, especially in this area that is so short of open space, that term you don't like so much, and I don't either, but parks or playgrounds or trails, our first step is just get them outside and let them feel safe and be in a place where they feel comfortable. And one of the things we've observed since June that really struck me is some people up there have never been on a trail, so they don't know what on your left means. So if a cyclist is coming around, they jump to the left. They think they're supposed to move to the left. And so we do a lot of work with neighborhood organizations, one called the Youth Service Project. So we've trained trail ambassadors to be up there, ask me about the 606, and they teach people sort of trail etiquette, how to share a space. And one of the gratifying things about opening day was after all this angst about this 14-foot wide path, how are people going to share it, there were no incidents. I mean, and you saw how jammed it was. So it was really fascinating that one purpose of public space and parks is to have this democratic space where people from all walks of life can be together. And so part of our goal is having people learn how to facilitate that and do these leadership skill training in that way. And so the monitoring of the flowering spectacle, I think, is going to be another really powerful way for these kids to get out there and observe in a different way than they're used to.
And I think what I would add to that too is it's because these places in urban environments, they're easier to get to. If you have a field trip for school kids, it's easier for the bus to get there. If you have, interns working for you in the summer and their parents can't drive them there, can they take public transportation there? It's critically important. So the access in terms of transportation to just even get there is much more viable in urban areas, and you can experience that nature. And one of the things we're doing with the Grow That Youth Farm that I wasn't really explicit about too is that the best way to create in not just the knowledge of nature, but what I would argue be the future generation of environmental leaders and conservation leaders is, so I'm of a certain age and a certain race, but that when you're with GrowDat, for example, we're working with young college graduates who are actually the ones working with the high school students, and the high school students are being trained to then work with the middle school students. And so when you have that closer range of connectivity of age and race and gender, I mean, then, whatever age the person is, they can see that mentor and say, I see myself there. I relate to that. It's not that 49-year-old white guy talking to, a 6-year-old. And so I think that to create that progression of age and the staging of that is a really powerful mechanism. And the National Science Foundation has been, using that system for a while too.
So with all these projects, obviously probably the most prominent example was the High Line in New York, but there's lots of them now emerging all over the LA River. There's all sorts of things you hear about. Are we really in a time of a paradigm change? Are we really, you think it's something fundamental where we're...
Given my age and how long I've been doing this, I think we are. I don't think we could have done this project 30 years ago.
Well, the wonder of it is how they ever get done.
Right, but the way we did it, and the notion of an artist embedded in the team, the notion of the level of civic engagement that the city agencies committed to, that people who, these 4 neighborhoods, I should say, on the western end are heavily Latino, on the eastern end very gentrified. Some of these folks had never been to Humboldt Park, and it's one of the most beautiful parks in Chicago. Some of the kids that live in Humboldt Park and Logan Square have never been to the lakefront. I mean, it's really fascinating how insular folks can be. So I do think getting people engaged in that design process and what they want to see there, and what we heard over and over again is more green and orchards and places to be outside. It was really powerful.
So with these huge projects, where's the impetus coming from? Is it top-down political leaders, planners? Is it bottom-up, people demanding these amenities? How does it... Where's it coming from? Is it in the air?
I think it's one of those convergence issues where, that book Tipping Point, where people started thinking about this, but approaching it from different angles. There were so many people looking at this elevated line for different reasons. We had early on envisioning the Bloomingdale, which was the early name of the project. Some people wanted it to be a people mover. Some people wanted 40-story urban agriculture, horticulture towers. Some people wanted to grow switchgrass up there and have a big combine. But having all of these folks having a common geographic denominator to look at and think about and look at it as part of their ecosystem, if you will. And what do you do with this thing? It's an eyesore, it's a place for mischief, and if you don't take care of it, it's going to fall down and kill people. So I think in cities across America, we have all these urban relics of our industrial past that we have to do something with. So I think that helps move it a little bit.
Yeah, I agree, and it's these relics, but also on top of that too, there's this generation that I'll just say is sort of in the 30s to 60s that grew up where we were increasingly being cut off from nature. And what I'm seeing in different communities, I'm definitely seeing it in New Orleans, is before I was talking about ages being closer and working with each other, but what I'm seeing in New Orleans and reconnecting to water, reconnecting to wetlands, is this communication between what I'll call the elder generation and younger people saying, I used to fish out there. There used to be houseboats out there. And then people in this 30 to 60 range saying, I just saw a wall. I just saw a railway. I didn't even know that was on the other side.
It's like
I didn't
invisible
know I was
space.
in wetlands. And so that connection is happening because we're able to bridge the older generation with the younger ones.
And
Well-
one other thing I was reading on the plane, the United Airlines book,
good
there
for
was
something.
this fabulous story, and the fellow's name I can't recall, but you should all find this magazine. When you ask about where is it coming from, and I think from all directions, and going back to your technology, this fellow lives in Alabama. He is a Hurricane Creek keeper. He's part of the River Keepers. He's 61 years old, lives out in the country. He has a camera and a YouTube account. And he was the reason why in the oil spill that decimated the Gulf Coast, he flew over with a buddy in a private plane and was the first person to capture the oil coming out that, really forced the hand of the oil company to admit what was going on.
Right.
So that power of connection of people and paying attention is really
Well,
changing.
and the
in a
positive, it
fundamental
demonstrates
way.
the positive way that technology can actually disseminate the information.
Yeah, and often it
And
takes,
stewardship.
what you're reminding me of, it often takes a crisis, whether it's a natural disaster or, in Detroit, where they're looking at all these abandoned lots where, how can we think differently? And the oil spill awakened us to a lot of that. Katrina awoken us to a lot of that. Superstorm Sandy in New York, they're talking about natural systems in the city, green space for greater infiltration, so it's not all on the storm drains and the subsurface, and oyster reefs as a natural barrier for storm surge. And so, these disasters do open up that conversation for natural systems in ways where it's not just, we need a higher levee and we need a bigger flood wall. How can we actually work with these natural systems for day-to-day recreation and betterment of our life, but also protection of our infrastructure and our communities?
Right. And work with them, not like we can dominate it, we can control it. It's an engineered solution. Those don't.
Which is it's a change.
It is.
It's
a
that paradigm change.
I really think that's happening.
I want to open up, we're running longer, obviously, than we hoped, but I want to open up to some questions from the audience. Maybe David, you raised your hand first.
In both the Big Lake project and the 606, you both use the term nature. So we're talking a softscape. Is there an optimal balance of softscape and related to hardscape? I like the idea of the roving, blooming thing along the I think it was the 606. But is there an optimal percentage of hardscape to softscape to achieve that feeling that we all get when we're in nature, but still within an urban environment?
I don't know. That's
As
a
I
really
learned-
powerful question.
And as I learned at a seminar earlier today, like all really good questions, the answer is it depends.
Depends.
I know, that's what I thought you were going to say.
Well, I will say this. In the 606, we were constrained. I mean, it was a 30-foot wide embankment. For the most part, it widens out to 120 feet. So what do you do in that 20 feet? Then you have the federal requirements for the minimum width of a trail and the ADA requirements. And so how do you do that and put as much of the softscape in there as possible in creative ways? And then the other big driver for us to achieve that balance, because it's a tight space, is, and the big distinction from the Highline is we have parks at the street level. When we started, there were only 2 parks at the street level. When we finish, there'll be 6. So that push to add more land for parks, I think, was probably at a subconscious level even, that constrained feeling is like, do you only want a trail or do you want a trail that's embedded in a park? And that tension drove a lot of the design decisions. Is this a trail or is it a park? Is it a park with a trail in it? So I think that's a really great question, and it probably does depend on the situation.
because I noticed there were several walls in certain of the slides, and that is part of the visual landscape, because we react to that hardscape differently from a softscape. It gives us different feelings as humans, and it would seem that if there were a scientific optimal percentage, it would perhaps be something that could be replicated in other urban areas that when we're talking about reclaiming. Well, what's the balance,
It's a good question.
Yes.
Coming from a water background, I sort of have an answer for that in what I would call a porous landscape versus a non-porous landscape. And that would be 70-30, 70 soft, 30 hard, 70 porous, 30 not. Just so you're in a city where I live, that's the rule of thumb to maximize infiltration and to minimize the runoff that goes to our storm drains and pumps. But that's sort of a different issue.
That's an engineering pattern. I'm looking at it.
I know.
More ethereal reactions that we have to
Expansive.
soft spaces versus hardscapes. Okay.
Thank you for this very interesting panel. I'm so glad you organized it. My name is Stella Tarnay, and you were speaking earlier about, there was a question about are we in a cultural moment about nature, and I think it must be true because about a year ago, a group of us started an initiative called Biophilic DC, and we're connecting with the International Biophilic Cities movement. And the interesting thing is that our working group started with urban biologists and with public health experts. So on our working group, we have North America's foremost expert on urban raccoons, which, if any of you know, I can connect you with him, interested, and a pediatric cardiologist. So our connection to natureful cities has been through the realm of ecological conservation and public health. So I'm very glad to be here and hear you make the connection of urban design. And if any of you are interested in talking to me, I'm very interested in making the connection for the DC project with urban designers.
I would love to talk to you.
Great,
One of
let's
our
talk.
most effective partners is CLOCK, the Consortium to Lower Obesity in Chicago's Children. And it's run by a physician from Northwestern University, and they have a particular focus on the built environment. And in Humboldt Park, we have among the highest incidence of juvenile diabetes and obesity in the country. And so these unlikely partners help you see things in a different way. So I think that you're right.
Thank you. I look forward
to hear about that.
Thank you. I look forward to talking. And I do have a question, which is somewhat related. But in my observation of having worked on green buildings, I found that there was a lot of disconnect between green policies and people's experience of the natural world. And so my question to you is, to what extent do you think urban designers are playing a connective role to advance green policies with green building, green roofs, low-impact development, and actually connecting urban citizens to those very progressive policies?
Well, I don't know if I could answer that at all, but I would say that you have to, the one is the policies have to be implemented, and they actually come, my point of view is that it has to come through the lens of design, which is what actually makes it meaningful and creates an experience for people who come to it. So there's always the abstract and then actually getting into the physical part of it. It's one of the things that's actually most wonderful about some of the work that we do, these commissions here in Washington, is we get to touch and help mold that design. We should take another one. Oh, go ahead.
I just have a quick question. I'm going to embarrass someone in the audience, Miriam Gusevich. When I was at Friends of the Chicago River, and we were having this debate over policy of whether you could accommodate a design or have a setback from the river's edge. And Miriam, who was a volunteer on our policy committee, said, oh, can I take those plans home? And redid them overnight and came back and showed, yeah, you could do it. But had we not had the physical design to show the lawyer that you could actually do it, we would not have shifted the conversation. So I think there's great power in design because people who aren't designers can't see it. So thank you, Miriam.
Jonathan, do you want to?
I had a question, but I wasn't.
No, I probably should have led with you.
Okay.
That's all right.
I just have a really quick
I guess a question. I'm interested in the reverberation from both of these projects because they're so strong in what they're doing internally. And I'm sure they both have rippled out in different ways, affecting maybe not necessarily the adjacent communities, maybe with 606, yes, but maybe with the park, it maybe has been more of a regional reverberation or impact. So I just was curious if you two could talk about that.
Sure. With the park at City Park, it definitely has been a regional reverberation because more and more tourists are coming into the area now, but whether it's Big Lake or the urban birding corridor, and the constituents of students are throughout the entire city. So it's bringing people who would have really thought, oh, that park is for other people, it's not for me. And it's bringing them in day-to-day working, and it's definitely a regional impact.
On the 606, there are a couple of levels. One, there's a group of a German professor who brings her class every year of urban designers and planners who have followed the project for a number of years now. So it's really interesting in the urban design community. They study this project, and my staff and I give lots of tours on that level. But I think in Chicago, what's been interesting to me, the impact in these communities is certainly very clear. And on the West End, folks are worried about property values and affordable housing. And so they're using this popular, very visible project to elevate the issue of affordable housing, which I think is great. And we had to drag our government partners to the meetings and say, let's talk about it. It's hard, it's messy, but we have to deal with it. And then in addition, there's always a north side, south side thing going on in Chicago. And there's 2 3-mile stretches of elevated track in Inglewood, which is a community on the south side that has the opposite problem of these neighborhoods on the north side. They have too much vacant space. They had huge population loss. And the idea for those 2 3-mile stretches is urban agriculture, not recreational trails. But the reverberation is, oh my gosh, you can do this. And so the approach is very similar, but it's the design and the inspiration to see what you could do is driving a whole new conversation, which is really exciting.
We have take a couple more questions. Miriam.
Thank you for wonderful presentations. My question really is, you're both in organizations that have a national and a regional scope, as well as being very involved with specific local projects. And I wondered if whether in your experience or the experience of other people that you collaborate with, whether you see any regional differences in attitudes, or whether, like in Washington, we still have representatives in Congress who don't believe in global warming or anything like that. And I wonder where these people come from, because in my experience of living in different parts of the United States, there always have been a lot of people who are very concerned, from very different fields, who are very concerned about conservation, about protection, as well as the great history that we have on this. So I just wondered, are there certain parts of the country where people are more aware that this is an issue, or is this just like everybody's equally aware, or do you have a similar kind of response? I'm just kind of curious about your experience. Anyway, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, I'll take a shot at that. I'll be curious in your response too. But with Audubon, our constituency is very broad. Some might be big lefties and some might not be. Some watch birds like this and some watch birds like this. They're not shooting endangered birds, though, just ducks. But beyond that, though, climate change is a very good example to bring this to fore. But what Audubon tends to do is when you're dealing with a farmer or rancher, or anybody else looking at a natural habitat, you just try to find that entry point into why these lands matter to them. And with climate change as a good example for me in Louisiana, where I live in a very blue city in a very red state. And there are many people in my state who are avid outdoors people and are promoters of the natural environment, and even in cities. But you know, if I'm starting a dialogue on climate change, I don't say, don't you think climate change is a really big issue? I might start with, boy, that ocean's rising really fast, isn't it? Look at that land eroding. Isn't that a big deal? Oh, it certainly is. We need to do something about that. Well, let's do something about that. So I just find the entry point that links to the solution rather than getting into believing in climate change and gravity and things like that.
And talking about birds makes it very
And
very
it does.
tangible.
Yeah,
Tangible.
and birds are that great entry point, birds and their habitats.
Well, and we find that parks, open space, I mean, public spaces, land, everyone has a connection to it. That it may be for very different reasons. And I think because we look at it holistically, that it's a nonpartisan issue, conserving land and building parks. I mean, it is, everyone loves them. And again, I agree completely. You have to find that common ground. And with climate change, it's the big divider, it seems to me, is what's causing it. Is it man or, you know, is it weather? So I do think different regions may have different approaches, but the fundamental connection is there. I don't think that is different anywhere in the country, in my experience.
I think we're going to go with one last question. I think he's been
First of all, I want to congratulate both of you on what you've done to implement your respective projects. The question I have for you is, given what you've done to integrate the natural environment for open space in both urban environments, what do you feel, or what have you done with respective of both projects, which have looked to be successful, to inculcate culturally the principles that you have brought together to implement your respective designs with the user population? In other words, it's all right to do something very successful and to bring in these environmental principles which work very well to create a physical edifice being an urban park. But the proof is in the pudding in terms of what do people do with that park over time. In other words, 5-10 years from now, what are you doing or what have you done to make sure that the culture is sensitive to those principles that brought those projects together, that the people that use them, that feel this is a nice place to do things, they may not know why, but the principles they understand are those pieces they understand that make it successful and make it useful for whatever their individual purposes or needs are for future generations, which is even more important than just putting together a physical project for a particular moment in time. In other words, 20 years from now when you're gone and doing something else and the park's still there and people still want to use it, there may be other challenges, environmental or otherwise, political or otherwise, that may confront those respective projects. Have you done anything to shore up or make sure that the users culturally understand the pieces that they need to protect, preserve, enhance, fight for, and maintain to sustain these respective parks?
Absolutely, and to get to that point, you know, it's not a one-off. It's an ongoing journey that every day you have to keep doing it. And so for us, it's a combination of, on the GrowDat project, of using the interns who are then the mentors for the students for the field trips, K through 12, with both hands-on experience, then curricular programs that are then embedded in their own classwork. And Beth mentioned the term citizen scientists, that these students, as they matriculate, end up becoming our volunteers and our citizen scientists. And so we're still new in this process. That's why I'm saying it's a journey. But my hope is that the high school students then become the interns, who then become my staff. We're working in other organizations, in open spaces, in urban areas and elsewhere. And that, for us, that pipeline is just starting. But my hope is that, that pipeline would continue, and then the younger people would be taught by the ones who are now in high school, and so on and so on. So that would be, but importantly, the hands-on experience and the curricular exposure, but then having them be your scientists, having them be your eyes on the ground, I think is critical.
Your question is so astute to why it is important to think about the long term and the stewardship, because if people don't feel invested in that park, they're not going to take care of it. They're going to walk away from it. So throughout the civic engagement process that we insisted on and raised private money to support, all of the principles were adopted in a formal framework plan that the agencies adopted. And it's a very complicated situation. You've got a separate Chicago Park District who owns the parks and manages the park-like structure up top. The city of Chicago owns all of the structure and the bridges. So there's an intergovernmental agreement in place that lays out the responsibilities between those two entities. Then as our job as project manager, one of our deliverables to the Park District is a long-term stewardship plan, and we're looking at various models. Should there be a conservancy? When we conclude our work as the project manager, which will take another 2 to 3 years, what entity will be in place dedicated to continuing the programming, continuing the work with the 21 schools? So part of that $95 million is a $10 million investment into the management and stewardship and programming so that you can set those up and create these partnerships with these major cultural and scientific institutions who are looking to go out into the neighborhoods and getting kids from the neighborhoods into their institutions. So we're figuring that out and looking at, if you have a good example for me, I'd love to hear about it. But we're currently looking at every conservancy model, partnership arrangement. The Chicago Park District has a goal of a local park advisory council for every one of their parks, and they've got, I don't know, nearly 600 parks. So how do you create a structure for 6 grade level parks and then this larger entity? But you are spot on, because this investment will be for naught if people don't care for it in the long term and make it a part of their daily lives and important to their communities. So if you do it right, you're building communities and strengthening them by the process of getting people invested in that park and building the leaders of the future. Like I said, some of these kids have never been to the lakefront, and one of the groups we work with is Westtown Bikes, and they're all about social justice on 2 wheels. So they teach kids how to repair bikes, and then they can go anywhere in the city that they want to go. So getting them out and spreading that word and supporting them is what we're in the process of doing. And then what's that structure at the end that's going to take it on?
Well, this is great. These are innovative. I keep coming back to the fact I feel like we are truly going into some different ways of thinking about it. These are different models. We've got technologies which are enabling new things, and we didn't get a chance to really talk about what it might mean in this city, but maybe we'll do it. Maybe NCPC will host another one like this. So with that, I know we're running over. We should probably conclude. It's been great to have you both here, and thank you to the NCPC staff for setting this up and the other sponsors. Thanks so much for coming. Thank you.